Hello, my name is Alta Bradshaw, and I am the wife of Daniel Bradshaw, and the two of us were together when we began to learn sign language, and we began to teach, to contact deaf people, to set up a deaf ministry in the church where we were going at that time. About 40 years ago, we learned signs. When I was growing up, my family lived in Iowa, and we would meet sometimes two deaf people, two deaf men who were in the church in Newton, Iowa, and they would come home from the deaf school. Summertime, Christmas, New Year's, and so we would meet them, but they were hard of hearing, so they would talk. They would sign to each other, and we would see them, between the two, but most of the time they would talk. Merlin and Paul Newforth. Okay. We were interested, and then once in a while, they would have a visitor from northern Iowa, and it was Bonnie. And so when Bonnie would come, and Merlin, and just Paul, the three of them would be talking back and forth. It was our first contact with deaf people, with sign language. We didn't feel impressed to learn because you were all hard of hearing and your voices were good enough. My grandma was a minister, and the family lived in Iowa, and so we'd go to visit before I got married, before I had children. So already, the seed was already there. We saw deaf people and we saw sign language, and they were the ones who would come and move here to St. Louis to help us to learn signs, because they're the first people who came to our church because we were learning sign language. We were interested. Without you, I would not be involved with deaf ministry. Okay, me and my husband, no family yet, no children, went to 13th and Gravois Church in St. Louis, Missouri.
Like Pentecostal church.
Pentecostal church. I remember him sitting next to him and paying attention to the minister, and we had learned signs, but Merlin, we didn't sign to him because he didn't sign to us. And so here they were, Bradshaw, who knew sign language, and Merlin, who used it, but not together, because his voice, he was hard of hearing. And suddenly it's like, Bradshaw turned to him and he said, "Merlin, can you understand the preaching?" And he said, and my husband just, because here he knew sign language, he had learned it to interpret, but didn't know that Merlin needed it because he talked pretty well, hard of hearing. And so he says, "Well, I'll be happy to sign for you." He said, at that time, headquarters, UPCI, had headquarters building on Grand and Gravois, which was just close to the church there where we went. And most of the headquarters people, all the home missions and foreign missions, the people lived close and they'd come to our church.
Superintendent.
When they were in town. Superintendent, Chambers. Brother Branding was the pastor. And me and my husband would go to that church. There was a deaf guy who would come, and once in a while he'd shake everybody's hand at the end of the service, and when he talked, his voice was, you could understand him. He was really, really deaf. Kenny Arnold. His mom came to that church and brought him until he was a teenager, and then he stopped coming. Once in a while, like for Easter, Christmas, once in a while. And he was always, shaking hands, but he was bored. He was out of there during church. We didn't understand why. Later, Brother Branding had a friend, pastor in Tennessee, and they would get on the phone on Sunday and kind of brag about, I had how many people in Sunday school? Well, I had, guess what? And so Brother Branding's friend, pastor, was Harold Hodges, and they would call and talk on a Sunday. And this time, Brother Hodges said, "Guess what happened this morning in our church?" And he told the story about this deaf guy who was healed. His ears were opened.
Wow.
And so Brother Branding was like, wow. So the story, he says, well, bring him to church, and I want you to minister, and I want this young man. What's his name? And it was Wilson.
Edward.
We'll have a picture.
So he brought Edward, and he got up. Oh, the mother, Kenny's mother, said, Kenny, there's a man coming, and he's healed. He's going to give his testimony. And Kenny, he says, I'm going to prove he's fake.
Ooh.
I'll be there. I'm going to sit on the front row, and I'm going to prove he's lying. So Kenny came over, and he sat on the very front. I remember over on this side, on the front row. And my husband, saw the two of them signing back and forth together. It's like, that's why he didn't come, because he couldn't understand. No signs, nothing. Couldn't hear. And so my husband, watching this and listening to that testimony, his heart was he felt that responsibility. That testimony, it was because of Kenny, watching. I mean, the story was impressive. Because he was talking about, he wanted to sing, and Brother Hodges says, no, until a Bible study, and then he let him sing an Old Rugged Cross. And the organist was playing, didn't know the signs, and so it was was playing on and on and on, and he signed, and it was finished, and he dropped his hands, and the order played on, because they weren't, he didn't know how long the song was, and the look, the expression on his face was because he heard for the first time the loud organ playing. But now Kenny, he's gonna prove that he's lying, he's fake, and he went up later, and just normal ASL, no problem. He was deaf. He was not pretending. He was not learning. He was really, really deaf, and he could talk. I mean, you could hear his voice too. Was a little bit, the hard of hearing voice, not as clear. You could. I think they're hard of hearing because the words are a little bit different. He had a twin. He'd telling that story, and his twin did not get his hearing. Was not healed. Dan Bradshaw went up to the pastor, Brother Branding, and said, I really am interested in learning sign language. I really would like to do that. And Brother Branding said, well, something's happening. Just hold on to that. I'm going to pray about it. I have something special. I'll tell you about later. What happened was Assembly of God minister was in charge, I don't know the sign for it, chaplain of Goodwill. Not very many places for deaf people to work. But here in St. Louis, one of the first places was Goodwill. And they had a deaf group who worked every day. Okay? They had a hearing minister, Assemblies of God, minister who was the chaplain. And he would be there every day. Well, he would invite other churches, pastors, to come and speak for 15 minutes. He would interpret this Catholic, Jewish, Pentecostal, just anyone who was willing to come, Lutheran, and it was spreading the word about deaf ministry. Brother Brotzman, from the Assemblies of God. And so Brother Guy Rome, R-O-A-M, had a deaf brother. I thought it was an uncle, but you said brother. And so he was invited to come and preach, and of course he went because he already had that sensitivity to deafness. Well, then he says, Brother Branding, you ought to hear, you ought to see what I saw at Goodwill. Okay? So he said, Brother Brotzman, do you mind? We have a Pentecostal minister down the street, 13th and Gravois, and I would like for him to come and see. So he was invited. He went over to preach for 15 minutes. And he went up and talked with the Assemblies of God minister. He said, where do you learn how to sign? Well, here's this book, Talk to the Deaf, Lottie Rickhoff. And so we had a book. He says, well, do you teach sign language? He had just moved here from Springfield to St. Louis, was a brand new minister, and he had just started for his Assembly of God church. Nobody showed up. Me and Bradshaw showed up 30 minutes once a week. Lottie Rickoff's book. And so we would get this book and we'd read and study it. Oh, it's old. We've written in the margins and it's really old and all worn out.
So you're saying that Brother Rome had invited Brother Branding. Brother Branding witnessed and saw it and talked to Brother Brotzman. And
Who said he had a
knew
sign language class.
of Bradshaw, who had just said that he was interested in one. And so Brother Branding told Bradshaw about the sign language classes.
And a book.
So you didn't go to Goodwill and witness that at all. You just showed up at those sign language
Brother
classes.
Rome showed up, who told Brother Branding, who told us because he had just had Brother Hodges send that deaf guy. Just happened. Like, we have felt God's touch, where he just led all along the way. And that's why we have always felt this is just strong faith that this is where God wanted us to be, what he wanted us to do. Second class I missed because I was pregnant. I mean pregnant with my first child. And Danita was born on my second class of sign language. We studied a lot. People were really amazed because we learned quickly. Well, we felt impressed. And so we studied a lot. Memorized, we played games, and then the people who really, now Kenny began to come a little bit, but not faithfully.
Right.
Well, he started coming pretty regularly when he saw that we were really serious. I mean, first we learned, and then he started coming. And I remember there was one person. So Brother Brandon didn't want to establish a class for one person. So Brother Bradshaw was teaching a boys' class at that time, about 11, 12, 13 years old. And Brother Branding wanted Brother Bradshaw to teach, to just put Kenny in that class and sign and teach at the same time he was teaching these young boys. There was no room for a deaf class. And if you recall, when you and Merlin came, you were involved with the boys' class.
I didn't come until 1967. That's when I first moved. Merlin moved in 1969, but you're right. We were on the third floor. Is that right? Up on the third floor where the children were kept. I remember Bradshaw begged me, he wanted me to go to church there. And I said, no, I prefer the Assembly of God because I was the only one. Plus, you're teaching children. I'd be in a children's class. I mean, I'd be the only one there, the adult with all these kids, sure. But I remember after that I found the truth about Jesus' name, baptism, that there wasn't a Trinity, and that's when I became awake and aware and then more willing to go to third kindergarten. And I remember there was all the little bitty kids on the third floor, but I accepted it because I learned a lot from him, and I learned so much more from him than I did the Assembly of God.
So really, Brother Bradshaw taught 12 years old, 13 years old boy, and one deaf person. And the lessons, we followed the book.
Same time, yes.
The UPCI book, he would follow that. But it was easy enough, I mean, it was easy for you to catch because some of those things were brand new ideas for you. Never interpreted before. So Bradshaw would talk and sign. Good thing she was hard of hearing and she had English so that she could follow the English, she could hear some.
Because Bradshaw was just learning the sign too. So he was
Patient.
during the church service. He played the trombone. He didn't
Trumpet,
interpret.
actually.
Or trumpet, I'm sorry, not the trombone, the trumpet. And I sat in the back because I hated sitting in the very front because I grew up hating church and I was so shy. I was dreadfully shy. But my mother and my grandmother prayed that the Lord would work on my life, and I started becoming more accepting and willing and not as shy to sit up in the front. So Kenny started to come, and then there was the two of us, and then two of us would sit up front. And every time Bradshaw would play the trumpet, he'd set it in his lap, and then he'd sign, and we sat over in the corner so that we could see him because the orchestra was in the front of the church. He sat in the orchestra playing his trumpet. And he'd play until there was no music, and then he'd set the trumpet in his lap, and then he'd sign what was being said to the deaf individual sitting in the corner. To Kenny and I, she's saying, sitting over in the corner. But then when it was time for the preaching of the word, he would move out of the orchestra and he would sit and interpret the word of the Lord as it was being given. Also, Bradshaw, sometimes he'd play his trumpet and he'd put it down and he'd go, hey, over to Alta, sitting over there. Because Alta had sat in the middle tend to say, and when she was pregnant with Jonathan, I guess at that time, because Tanita was 2, she's saying you were 2, he'd sign across the room, just bold and open mind, right in front of everybody. He wasn't shy at all. It was just embarrassing. It was so embarrassing, Bonnie saying, but he was embarrassed about it.
We learned sign language and didn't know a lot about deaf culture. I mean, we met hard of hearing people, and they were our first interpreters because they would have to interpret for us. We were English signs, okay, signed English. When the first deaf people came, like Ronnie and Janet first.
And Janet was 1969.
So when they would come, they were really deaf. And Kenny and Sally Rowe. And it's like, so we didn't know how to sign ASL. Didn't know what that meant, American Sign Language. And it wasn't called ASL.
It wasn't discovered as a language yet. Because that wasn't
That was set up later.
And we didn't know how to tell them.
So we signed to her.
Now I understand what ASL, I understand what that means and how to say that. But
So
then we didn't.
we would sign English, because she understood and Merlin understood English signs, and we thought, boy, we're doing a good job, And our signs, we were careful to choose so that they were the right meaning. And I mean, they really helped. And I think we really had pretty good for no classes, no sign language books that were like, that was just words.
Yeah.
That was not language.
It was like dictionaries.
There was no videotape. There was no movies. There was no classes. There was no college courses.
That's right.
We were just learning and interested to learn. And so the Lord really led us to understand before ASL was even invented, that word.
I remember when Kenny came, and Sally came. They were more fully deaf. They were more ASL. That's when it became much harder.
So
for
they
you.
interpreted for us.
Yes.
Me and Bradshaw would sign English, and then she would turn and
Interpret.
ASL.
And they didn't like it. I would get so upset afterwards. And
They wanted us to talk straight one-on-one and not to go through them.
go through Merlin and
They
mine.
wanted one-on-one. But we didn't understand their language, and so it's like, so they would
It
start.
was insulting to it. It was as if we were treating them as children or more stupid.
Okay, so they would sign.
Because Dan and Alta were dependent on them to explain and translate.
But we didn't know that. But they confronted. I mean, they're very blunt, very blunt. And so they said, we don't like it. We don't like you're always like looking at them, and we want you to look at us, Okay, and so we would look at them, and they would sign, and then we turn and sign what they and then we'd sign to them, English, sign to them. And then they turn them and say, what is that? And then she'd sign. Until we learned. And we did learn, because sometimes they weren't there to interpret for us. And so you have to learn. It's kind of and we were with them. I mean, we had church 4 or 5 times every week. And they would come faithfully. It wasn't just Sunday. It was 5 times a week, sometimes more.
Yeah, revival.
Okay, or they would come to the house and they would want us to help to read something or to write a letter or to help them with something. That was before interpreters, professional interpreters, none. So they would come and ask for help. Like, I got this letter from, it's legal, I don't understand it, and so we would read it and explain it. Or
Make a phone call.
make a phone call for, we didn't have TTYs, not at first.
Phone calls, I remember.
TTYs.
I remember helping.
Very few people had them. Since we had a lot of headquarters people seeing signs up in front, Bradshaw was already sitting up in front. We didn't have to ask for a special seating. If they wanted to see and understand, they had to come up and sit in front. So we had a little special place where the deaf people would come. They said, well, they need to see, and it's up in front, and they don't, heads up in front, and so, this front seat, which one was first, you remember?
First on the right side, and then later we moved to the left side.
It always followed where Bradshaw was playing his trumpet. And I would sit with them, and we would transfer. But I enjoyed it. I sat here on the front with the deaf group because I knew that Bradshaw would get tired, and so I would sign some, and then he would sign some. But I had to watch my children.
We sat in the front
In the
row.
front, yes.
Very well behaved children, I want you to know. Because he would correct us from across the church.
They understood signs very quickly. And they learned from a very young age. So headquarters people would see us right up front, and Brother Brandy, he would enjoy seeing a sign together as a, so he'd have us come on up, and first Bradshaw stood on a chair. Do you remember? On a chair? He had him stand on a chair, and he was trying to sign like this. He wanted everybody to see it, and then finally he said, "Come on up here to the platform," because it was, quite high. And then Bradshaw would sign in front. And then when you guys would learn to sign language songs as a group, then they'd turn around, same song. We got tired of it.
Goodbye, world, goodbye. That was their favorite song.
Yeah.
See the deaf, and whenever the orchestra would start playing that song, we knew.
Come on, stand up.
They're going to ask us to stand and turn around and sign this song.
Yes. Yeah. And so
Bonnie's
headquarters
gonna
people
add
saw
something.
it. People would come to Sunday school convention. All 48 states would have a representative to come to the conference at headquarters city, and so 2 or 3 times every year, a lot of ministers from all over the United States would come to 13th and Gravois, because that's where headquarters people would go. So they were in town, they'd fill out those seats in the back, and they'd come up and say, "Oh, I've never seen that, it's wonderful," And so they'd spread the word. They'd go home and they'd say, "I saw deaf people speak in tongues, and deaf people are healed," and so spread the news, spread to all of UPCI all over the nation, and to foreign missionaries as well.
So I wanted to add something when you were talking about July of 1969. You recently had asked me about that, and I remember when everyone came to my home and I was talking, we were asking about the Bible, and there was so much, and I asked my oldest sister Ramona, if you don't mind calling Bradshaw and asking maybe we could have a separate church service on Saturday night. And my sister said, "Okay, we can check and see." And she called Brother Bradshaw. They talked about it, and we waited, and we had the answer that yes, on Saturday night we were able to go into the basement, into another room. During Saturday night youth service, we were able to go to a separate, and that's a separate service, like Bible study for the deaf. And that's when Brother Bradshaw felt, "Oh, wow, it'd be wonderful to have a separate church." And I remember the worship and the prayer that we had. I remember that you saw a deaf lady, Assembly of God man had invited her to come to Bible college in Springfield. And I remember you watched this Catholic man explaining, or this Assembly of God man explaining the way to get the Holy Ghost. And you watched, isn't that when you became burdened yourself? I remember you telling that story once before about how you became burdened to work with the deaf. Because I remember you telling that before too, because it hit you when you witnessed someone else explaining the plan of salvation, and then she said a little prayer, and he said, "You're saved," and you went,
"I'm not saved."
But so
I remember. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And then it was a hearing lady from Indiana or Ohio came to church. She'd been at the altar, it was the altar call, and she was praying with signs, and someone saw her signing as she was praying and said, "Oh, we want to contact Bradshaw, hurry, get him." She was still worshiping, and they walked her around and took her down to the basement and said, "Look at it, she's signing." And all the deaf people looked as this hearing individual was using a different language, was speaking in American Sign Language, speaking in tongues.
Wow.
And they brought her all the way to the basement so Brother Bradshaw and the deaf could see her speaking in tongues using American Sign Language. And then Bonnie said, I caught her, like spell, what was it? L-O-V-E, kind of like a stutter, like you do it in, and I understood love. And then she signed like heaven or paradise or the waiting place. Yeah, paradise. And I caught that sign. There was it wasn't a clear language that we could understand, but
She was
it was
speaking
in
in
sign
different
speaking
sign
in
language
different sign
tongues.
language.
Oh, wow.
We had some miracles. Just
That same
Same
night.
night. I mean, we got loud. Deaf people are not quiet in church. And the people upstairs, the hearing church, would be kind of quiet, and then we would be shouting. Kenny would, remember, he'd bang on the chair. And they knew when we were all excited and something was happening, and people would kind of sneak down and see what was happening downstairs. You remember hearing people?
Yes. That's when we started having separate deaf services from then on.
Yeah.
It was the need. She wanted to learn more about. She had questions, and she didn't want to in hearing church because she was afraid other people would already know, and she would feel kind of stupid.
The same night in July of 1969, that Saturday night, that there were so many deaf people visiting and had been curious about the Bible and questions, and so had a very special permission given. That was the night that hearing individual was signing. And they brought her.
I always talk about my
class.
children when the first time they felt impressed to learn sign language, but I forgot myself because there was that time when, there's a line. It's up to that line. It's like, that's enjoy. I learned. Sign language is beautiful and wonderful, and then it's like involvement, and that was the night when I felt that impression that it was my ministry, not just Bradshaw's. And then we became a team. Home missions. There were two people, the director and the secretary. The director at that time was J.T. Pugh, and the assistant, or the, what do they call it, the secretary of the home missions was J.R. Enzi. And the two of them invited me and Bradshaw to go to headquarters. At that time they had moved out here to Hazelwood. No, or is it? It's Hazelwood. And they invited us to go up, and we sat and talked. And the two of them asked the two of us about our feeling about deaf ministry and burden or impression, the focus of our work for God, and how serious. And we were really like something that he would expect to go on with, and asked if we would be willing to share our story. Would we be willing to write something that could be published and given out at the conference? Would we be willing to stand up and give a talk in front of the international conference? To think, what would we say if we had just 1 hour? What we'd say in a workshop. And they set up a room for deaf ministry, and published, they give a schedule. If you're interested in this ministry, go to that room, and if you're interested in deaf ministry, go to that room. And we had, I think, 1 hour, and we had brand new published that How Shall They Hear? That was the first thing we published. Okay, and they gave us 5 minutes, the two of us, 5 minutes, in front of all these people. What can you say? I can't remember if it was 3 minutes or 5 minutes, but it was very brief, and so we were like.
Oh, I remember it was.
And if
fast.
I remember, I think that one talked and the other signed, and then the other one talked and this one signed, so that we could because you could talk fast without worrying about how to sign it correctly, and. People cried. People would come, it was an invitation to come and hear more about deaf ministry at that workshop. It was on home missions Saturday. And that was the first time it was presented in front of all of
General
UPCI.
Assembly.
And it was impressive.
So you,
What happened at every conference from there, starting, we didn't have deaf people at that conference because you weren't going. I mean, you know, very.
I remember Texas with you that
Yeah.
time. That's the only one I remember.
But Atlantic City,
And then
New
here,
Jersey,
the one that came
there
to
was
St.
no
Louis.
deaf people,
You
and we
were
wanted them to see signs. We wanted them to see deaf people, and so we prayed about it. And if the Lord wants someone deaf to be there, well, you know, and it happened. Bradshaw was out just shopping, looking, and he saw sign language on a porch. And he said, "Hi." He said, "Are you deaf?" "Yeah." "Come on up." You know, it's like signs is an instant invitation to come and talk because so few know them. So I was not with them at that time. I think I was probably taking care of the booth information and talking with people there. So Bradshaw was out and met these people, invite them to the service, and he talked with the usher and said, "If you don't mind, you know, I have some deaf people who are coming, and we really need a reserved area, you know, for several people." And that was the first time we had reserved seating. They came and but from then on, every conference, the Bradshaws would go and have a booth, and we'd have something new printed, and you have copies of some of that, the tracts, the informational brochures, advertising and stuff. And every conference we found some deaf people who would come, willing to come. Why'd you come to
13 years.
UPCI? Why?
I found out through the Assembly of God. I found out the truth through UPCI, and found out Trinity was a mistake,
And then Jesus' name was.
and Jesus' name was the truth. I was 14 years old, and I saw my two sisters. They had real pretty dresses on. They were going out, and I thought, well, I want to go out. And I asked my mother, "Where are they going?" And she said, "Well, they're going to church." And I said, "I want to go to church with them." And my mom said, "No, and you know, you don't have the clothes, you don't have a tie, you have to be dressed up." She told me we'd buy me some nice clothes. So I remember when my birthday came, I opened up my birthday gifts and I had a suit and tie, and I was excited because I knew it meant I was going to get to go to church. And then we went to a Methodist church at that time. I remember going and walking in, and they took me up and put me in a group of the same age as I was. But it was difficult. The usher asked me, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'm 14. And he said, "What grade are you in?" And I think I was only in 3rd or 4th grade. Or 5th, 4th or 5th, I don't know for sure. So they went putting me in with children who all sat and just stared at me. Because they thought I looked like, what? Oh, David and Goliath. I was Goliath. We were the same age,
Reading at the same level.
but I was so much older than them, so they didn't think that worked out. So then they took and put me into the same age group, and the same age for Bible study. You know, it was hard reading and understanding. And I was there for about 3 years, and I decided to go to a different church. Presbyterian? Yes. I went to a Presbyterian church, and I could understand the reading because it was a comic style, more funny, and they had pictures that I was able to read, and so I kind of picked up by reading the words and a little bit of English that I knew. So when I graduated in 1959, I wanted to make sure I caught the right year. I was free to go wherever I wanted to go, and to the different churches where deaf individuals were. I went to the Baptist church and hung out with deaf people there. I went and learned some more from the Baptists, and then I went to another church, to a Lutheran church. and learn some more from them. And then I remember visiting the Assembly of God church. And then I really started to understand and became more motivated than I had from the others. So I stayed at the Assembly of God church for 13 years. And then I started thinking of Bonnie. You forgot about 1965, the Assembly of God camp. Okay. It was in 1965 I went to Illinois Deaf Camp. On the Deaf Camp grounds with the Assembly of God, and I met Bonnie. And we met and talked, got to know one another. 2 years later, I went to Assembly of God church, and I walked in and I saw Bonnie was there. And I remember I had met her before. Where was it from? And then it occurred to me at the Assembly of God church campgrounds in Illinois. Okay, I remember that. And she would come and visit me from time to time, and we would talk, you know. And then I wouldn't see her for like 5 years, but I'd never forget about Bonnie. Bonnie was always in the back of my mind. And I remember I needed new clothes. I went and bought, oh, you forgot about me being sick. Oh yeah, that's right. I called her sister and say, how is Bonnie doing? And was told that she was real sick. And then I heard about her from Kenny. That's how I would hear about Bonnie, was Kenny Arnold. I meet up with him from time to time. So I went to her UPC church. And I went in, I got real early. And James Casey was there. No, we were the only ones there until more deaf people started arriving. Okay, until God touched my heart. And I spoke in tongues and got baptized and received the Holy Ghost. In 1976 on Easter Sunday.
During this time of Bradshaw's ministry to the church, to the deaf church, we had a lot of deaf people come to visit, and we took the group, instead of being up in front of the church, we would take the group downstairs for Saturday night. We had a special room that they set aside for us. And so the word kind of spread around that there's a deaf church, a new deaf church in St. Louis. And so the deaf people want to know what was happening over there. And so, I mean, it spread. A lot of people started coming. But it was not just because of Bradshaw. It was because of the deaf people who would spread the word to their friends. Come on and see. Bible, you can ask. See, the thing that made the difference, that really drew in deaf people, was not because the interpreted service, not because of the music was peppy and people were dancing around. It was when they were separated downstairs where the deaf people could stand up and give their own testimony. The deaf people could explain they knew that Bradshaw was open-minded, just anything they wanted to know, ask me. If I don't know, I'll look it up, I'll find out, and we'll explain it. First time Bradshaw would prepare like a preaching, and he'd, write down in verse and verse and verse, and he's going to preach on all that. We get stuck on one verse halfway, that's all, because someone deaf means what? Okay. Well, the word means means what? Bradshaw.
Definition of words. Why did he describe gravity one time? And he brought the bucket of water to describe, because the deaf people, they didn't understand what means gravity, how it works. Something about the scripture about how the Lord even put the earth revolving, something that he was saying, the wonderful God that created this earth, and how the planets, and they did, and so he would demonstrate.
We had pictures.
By bringing the bucket of water, and he swung the bucket of water to demonstrate how the water doesn't come out. How the earth revolves, how we are here. Dad always would tell how when he got that bucket of water, at first they didn't know what he was planning to do, and then he stood up and he was ready to swinging, and that lady went, she didn't know that the water was going to stay in the bucket.
Deaf ministry. People would hear about it and come to visit St. Louis, and they wanted to talk with Bradshaw. And we'd invite them to come to church. And this two people from Ohio, they were hearing people. And they were interested. They wanted to learn sign language, and they had learned. They'd gone to classes and learned some, but they wanted to know how to teach deaf people about Bible truth. And so they came, the two of them, and well, come on to church and I'll show you how we teach. We always had, like, we drew and we had pictures and we had actions, just anything for, visual. And what was so wonderful is that Bradshaw already had learned, and he had like shelves of things that he used for children. Children's church, junior church, camp meetings. So he already had things, Bible truths that were simple, easy to understand, clear, using things that you could see. And then, like, what does that mean? Oh! Okay. Well, so these people came, these two, and it was a Sunday morning, and someone asked about, it was New Testament, I think it was Easter, because I remember it was about the Virgin, or maybe
Christmas,
I don't remember, but it was talking about the virgin birth. What's a virgin?
Deaf person's question.
Knowing that many of the deaf kids in school are not, at that time, you didn't talk about sex education.
Don't.
You didn't talk about men, women together. They had the girls separate and the boys separate, never.
Never.
And so here, I mean, like, just innocent. Nothing. And so what does it mean, a virgin? Why is Mary, why
is that significant?
Important? Why? This story about birth. So he had to just stop, put it aside, and talk about pregnancy.
Sex education.
Sex education. And these two almost quit deaf ministry because they couldn't believe that they would have to talk about that in front of church. Circumcision.
Circumcision. Yes. What is it?
What is a eunuch?
Mean?
Yeah.
A eunuch.
Yeah.
Sodom and Gomorrah. Why was that a sin? I remember after the General Conference in 79. Do you remember in Indiana, Home Missions gave to you something to read, and the response to answer, there was then about the needs in deaf ministry. There were states that would write to her letters, and you'd have to respond to all of those. I remember the stacks of correspondence that came, and they'd say, "Do you mind helping me?" Finally, she worked so hard that she almost broke down over it. I need to congratulate her. There was no one else that helped her. She was doing it on her own. So I need to thank her. No one else was taking on that responsibility. I was inspired by her, and I really appreciate her hard work. God bless you for it. Well, I was talking about the papers. Whenever we printed things and we needed to staple, like that breaking the sound barrier, we would buy pizzas. And you remember, and the students from the college and the our church, deaf church, and my kids, my 4 kids, and we'd walk around the table, and we'd set up like
assembly line.
We'd walk, and then somebody would shuffle them together and and we had
humongous staplers, big old staplers to staple them. Nothing automatic. By hand, hard way.
I had to type the addresses and labels because we did not have any kind of computer. We didn't have any kind of a mail machine. Oh, I forgot that. Well, if we had letters and they had glue on the envelope, so I had my 4 children.
Yes. We would sit and put our tongues up.
Is your turn?
Yes!
They were laughing. We made it fun. I mean, it's like, you do what you have to do.
Didn't have glue sticks then.
She wasn't there to help with that.
At our house, at home, because Mother was responsible for correspondence.
Hey, not only that, this paper right here, we did not have, when you typed, you had to like white out.
Carbon copies.
No, you had these blue ditto sheets, and they had like wax cover on it, and you'd roll them through. It was a manual typewriter, okay? And if you made a mistake, sometimes you'd have to just rip it up and start all over again. Okay, if you couldn't like fix it real easily, and then you'd give it to someone, they put it on this big roll, and then you had to be careful not to touch it because you have blue or ink, ink all over your hands.
Dad didn't know the signs for the curse words.
Yeah,
And we had a deaf lady who was coming, and her very angry husband, I think, showed up at church, angry, I think maybe drunk, I don't know for sure, but he showed up very angry, signing, and my dad, he knew the man was angry, but he did not understand what was coming out of his hands.
and the girls were like,
oh yeah, the girls
red face.
and they're feeling very frightened and threatened, and my father just knew, heated. Well, deaf people sometimes show emotion and not really angry. But my father asked Merlin to teach him the cuss words so that he would know and recognize the next time if an individual showed up and was using incorrect language. Merlin, oh, teach you bad words.
Private words. Deaf people don't show some of those words because they're very private, sexual related. It's been a wonderful. I mean, just totally immersed, and it's been just an honor. It's been an honor.